Thank you and good afternoon to all of you. Um, Happy Jubilee. It's the only reason I came. But I am really honored to be with you because I know about the Marshall Fellows and the Marshall Foundation and what this institution has done to make a better world the last 75 years. There's no American that I know, certainly within my lifetime, that I admire more than George Marshall. I mean, we've been blessed in our country with great leaders, as you have in the UK and other nations around the world. But I would put Marshall right up there with Washington and Lincoln as to what he did. And because he was so understated, he never looked really for any recognition. So to have the Marshall Foundation be part of that, to not just recognize him, but to enlist all these great, bright young people over the years to be Marshall Fellows, and we have some amongst us, that's a big deal. And it's a sign of his lasting contribution, not just to the United States in the West and the UK, but to the world. I'm going to take just a minute or two to share with you kind of my thoughts about not just Marshall, but what he represented and how it relates to today. 75 years ago, with that amazing speech that he gave at Harvard, he really built the foundation for the post-World War II world order. I recently reread a book that many of you have read, Dean Acheson's President of Creation. I've read that book twice and I've referred to it many times in my career in government. But when you read that and you think of Marshall, and not just as Marshall, the architect of the Allied victories of World War II, but then what he did afterward was really spectacular. Secretary of State for a couple of years, and then when our Pentagon was new and no one really knew how to put it together, President Truman asked Marshall to go be Secretary of Defense and put the Pentagon together. No American has ever held both of those jobs. Then what he did in China, but his career was one of not only lasting, but continuing contributions. Every time he thought he was finished, no, you're not. The president would call him back. Pretty amazing. And how it relates to today is that world orders don't last forever. And this one has lasted for 70 years, roughly. It's done a lot of good in the world, starting with we've had no World War III. We've had no nuclear exchange, and every world leader went to their graves after World War II, very concerned about that. But yet it didn't happen. I attribute that to a lot of leadership, a lot of good fortune, a lot of people being part of that and keeping that from happening. But if we would not had the structure, a rules-based world order, I'm not sure we would have been that fortunate the last 75 years, because we built a world that had some boundaries, imperfect problems. But when you really review what happened the last 75 years, and I attribute Marshall's speech at Harvard to really being the base of that. Yes, it was the geopolitical, the security dynamics of that world order, but also the economic dynamics, which were critically important because it allowed people to have hope, possibilities, exchanges, more freedom, education. all that makes a world prosperous, makes a world better, makes people better, gives people hope, which is the essential. Because when we have a hopeless world, we've got a world in a lot of trouble. And I fear today where we are, we're getting close to that. And complicating that in a world of almost 8 billion global citizens is a political divide and a political polarity that's very dangerous in democracies because it questions institutions, basically. And when you question institutions, even worse, when you don't trust institutions, and we've gone through that in the United States of America the last few years in elections, then not good, any good follows that. Because when societies lose trust in very institutions that keep them together, that you have to have confidence in, not just politics, but the rule of law, elections, the judiciary, education, religion, then that society is fragmenting right before our eyes. And what I think is important, if we learn the lessons that Marshall taught us and what he gave us, and we recognize where we are in the world today, that we're going to need to build a new world order, a 21st century world order. And we are building it now. That's happening now. It's always going to be bumpy. Again, just read Dean Acheson's book, and you recall that the first 10 years that we were trying to put this world order together after World War II, it wasn't easy. It was not easy. But we stuck with it, and we had the kind of leadership that was so critical, both in our country, the United States, and across the Atlantic in the European continent. And much of that was because of Churchill and the leadership here in the UK. But we are at that point now. We need to build a new world order. We must, for the survival of mankind. Because if we allow the boundaries to so erode and lose respect in those boundaries and the institutions that administer them, and the reason for those boundaries, we will have lost more than we realize. I think also it's important to recognize that so much of what that world order was based on, the post-World War II world order, was common interests. The institutions that we built, what I've always referred to as coalitions of common interest, the United Nations, IMF, World Bank, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, Collective Security, NATO, dozens of multilateral development institutions. That wasn't for America. That wasn't for the UK. That wasn't just for the West. That was for the world, the common interest of the world. Because if we all citizens of the world had enough common interest to help us all, then maybe we could be united in some purpose, not just to make a better world for your country or your family or your people, but when we all are successful, when we all can grow, that's good for the world. Imperfect problems, and also because of the issues, the challenges that we have today that we didn't have 75 years ago. Start with climate change. That wasn't an issue. Something that Daniel knows a little something about, energy. It's going to be a huge, huge challenge for the world, as is climate change. Hopelessness is a pretty big problem that we've got today. And it's not going to get better soon. Terrorism, clean water, famine. These are challenges and realities that we're going to face for a long time. And we're not going to be able to solve them if we're so polarized and so politicized and so opposed to each other that we can't work together. I'm an optimist by nature. I used to tell my Senate colleague, Olympia Snowe, and some of you know her, she and I sat together on the Intelligence Committee, and she would come into an Intelligence Committee meeting. She would be very down and dark and upset, throw her books on the table. And I said, Olympia, what's wrong? Oh, the world's going to hell. I'm not happy. I said, well, Olympia, you can't do anything about this, but you're too damn Greek. I mean, this Greek tragedy, you just can't live it every day. I mean, at some point, you've got to get up in the morning and say, you know, the sun's out, it will get better. Well, I think we have to all look at that aspect of it, not Pollyannish, not put our heads in the sand, but we can fix this. We can fix these problems in the world. And I see a lot of good signs. I know we're going to be talking in the next panel about Ukraine, Russia. Terrible, terrible, terrible. And you all know. But one of the things that's coming out of this is the world is seeing the evilness of totalitarianism. The world is getting a very good direct look at what evil can be perpetrated in the world. It's terrible, but it's instructive. And now if we're all smart enough about this, we can use this to do something to fix it. China, yes, big, strong, vital country, but like all totalitarian governments, they overplay their hand. And because the world is so aware today, I mean, social media has turned everything upside down. Science, technology, it's given us more capacity and more capabilities than any generation in the history of mankind. And so for my children and your children, grandchildren, they may have bigger problems, bigger challenges, but yet they've also got more capability. They've got more capacity to solve these problems, to fix them if we're smart enough. And one of the great places and the right places to start is looking at George Marshall and what he did, and we'll solve them. So I look forward to being with my learned colleagues and friends and with all of you. And again, thank you very much for allowing me to come today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Hagel. That was excellent remarks. I'm Sharon Von Hippel, the director of a think tank in London called the Royal United Services Institute. Pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm not a Marshall Scholar, but I'm a big believer in the transatlantic community. And what I'd like to do today in this short period of time that we have together is first briefly introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to ask some questions, and hopefully we'll still have some time at the end for some questions from the audience. So I think all of you know our three speakers: Secretary Hagel, former Secretary of Defense, the first Vietnam veteran and enlisted combat veteran to serve in that role. He served as a senator in representing Nebraska for 2 terms. Harold Koh, professor at Yale Law School and the former dean of Yale Law School, and also served in 4 U.S. administrations, including Obama, when I also served. At the same time, we called him L, if you know the vernacular inside the State Department. Dan Yergin, who is the vice chairman of S&P Global, a leading authority on energy, international politics, and economics. And his book that came out last year, The New Map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations, came out in 2020. He talks a lot about Russia and Ukraine, so very prescient. His previous book, The Prize, won a Pulitzer Prize. So we're really lucky to be speaking with 3 world-renowned experts on 3 of the issues, the critical issues that are so important to this war in Ukraine: the energy question, the military campaign, and questions of justice and international law. So it's really a privilege to be here. Just a reminder, this is going to be Chatham House rules. I'm sorry, I'm having to crank my head to look at everybody. But so please do not attribute what each speaker said, even though you can obviously repeat the argument that they made. So I'd like to start with Harold Koh and ask about this, about the legal issues related to this conflict. Now, there's always a possibility that Putin will stay in power. And he doesn't only have blood on his hands, he's got blood all over his body. How do Western leaders deal with him going forward if he stays in power? What do we do? How do we approach that challenge?
Well, thanks, Karen, but I have to say thank you to the Marshall Scholarship. In 1975, they let me into a room that looked like this, and 47 years later, I'm still allowed in this room. And there's an amazement about that. I just want to suggest a couple ideas. First, Putin's short game is force. The world's long game is law. And law will take longer, but it has to be the solution. Secondly, the two ideas I think functioning here are a fragmented Nuremberg and an accelerated Dayton. So the long-term solution, I think, is a Dayton type of discussion in which accountability is specifically left on the table. Remember that we got to a difficult peace in Dayton for Bosnia, but both Milosevic and Karadzic went to the tribunal and both got tried. Milosevic died, but Karadzic is in prison, as is Mladic. And I think that's the model. But this is not like Nuremberg in that nobody's in custody. All the Nazi leaders were defeated, and Putin has 200,000 troops and nuclear weapons. So it's not going to be easy to get him in the dock. But there are multiple efforts that are going on. I should say I represent Ukraine at the International Court of Justice. We brought a case there. But what else is going on? There's an effort to get criminal accountability, both in domestic and international tribunals. As you saw, the Ukrainians tried and got a plea against a Russian soldier last week. The International Criminal Court is now cooperating with the US government. And amazingly, Lindsey Graham, who had been the biggest opponent of the ICC, is suddenly all in favor. So this is a huge opportunity. I think the Justice Department should, under Biden, offer to send 20 prosecutors over and start working with them right away. The prosecutor, Karim Khan, has said he would go back to 2014 in terms of war crimes, in other words, before Crimea. And then finally, there's an effort to set up an aggression tribunal to try Putin himself. This is being spearheaded by Gordon Brown, but has about 40 former leaders. It's a little complicated because, if all these efforts go to set up these accountability mechanisms, it might dissuade Putin from going into negotiations, and he might want to try to bargain his way out, which he should not be allowed to do. But all of these efforts are going on in a very robust way, which shows how much the idea of accountability has infiltrated our concept of no peace without justice.
That's great to hear, because I think all of us let him get away with too much for too long beforehand by not pushing back in 2008, 2014, Crimea, and even when he went into Syria in September 2015. Okay, let me move to Dan. Let's talk a bit about the ping-ponging in the energy space. We all watched COP26. Not everybody was happy with the results, but certainly we're all committed to helping with climate change. Now we have this war, and all of a sudden we're talking about investing in fossil fuels again. Can you just talk through, is this about that tension? Is it long-term, the climate change proponents, are they going to win?
Well, I think actually what you just described is reality. I mean, the world is still 80% hydrocarbons. The world was already in an energy crisis last October, long before. In fact, it was in an energy crisis at the time of COP26. And I think what I maybe described as preemptive underinvestment in conventional resources, and we're paying a price for that, and we'll pay a price in terms of social instability and high prices. And it accentuates the importance of Russia. So I think it isn't a either or, but it's rather managing it and just keeping them in mind the scale of it. But energy transitions, I was thinking we can date the beginning of the energy transition. I don't know if anybody's here is from Shropshire, but it began in January 1709 in Shropshire, when a metalworker figured out that you could use coal better to make iron than wood. But all these other energy transitions happened over a century, and there were really energy additions. It was one thing on top of another. Oil overtook coal in the 1960s. And today the world uses almost 4 times as much coal. So I think trying to change the energy basis of a $90 trillion economy in 28 years is a very daunting job, and getting the timing wrong and the sequence wrong can have serious consequences.
Okay, thanks. I'll come back to you about the transition in a minute. And then Secretary Hagel, talk to us a bit about this war. It's everyone assumed Russia would win in a very short period of time. They've underperformed in so many ways. Now, is it about the corruption based on the military modernization? We've all heard how much money was stolen. Was it a bit of overconfidence coupled with poor planning, poor training? Is it because troops didn't know they were going to fight? Is it about the hierarchical command structure that so many talk about, which doesn't allow soldiers on the ground to take decisions? Is it that war is just tougher than everyone realizes and things never work out according to plan? Is it about Putin directing this campaign, which is what we've been hearing at least? Or is it something else? Talk us through this. Easy question.
Well, I think you listed most of them. Seriously, you have listed the main reasons, but I'd put it this way: 3 main reasons that they have had such difficulty and have failed in initial strategies. One is, you mentioned his military. He's got a very ineffective military. One reason, and probably the core reason why they have failed so often, is they have no NCO corps, non-commissioned officer corps. And you can't develop a strong, coherent, capable fighting body without that. The Romans did it about as well as anybody until the West came along, the United States, and our allies. When I was at the Pentagon in 2014, I was in China, and I met with Xi about 3 times during the summer of 2014. They were not pleasant meetings, and they took me out to show me their NCO corps, the Chinese. It was very impressive. Well, they had copied everything we do, but the Russians never did that, and it's been a fiasco for them. Their top-down structure, when you're invading another country like they are, even a smaller country, less quality, less armaments, logistics are everything. When you move 100,000, 150,000 troops into another country and you invade and intend to occupy, which they've never been able to do, logistics are everything. You can't have an effective logistical trail or train without a very effective NCO corps. So it's number one, his military itself. 2, a total underestimation of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military. I mentioned 2014, and when I was Secretary of Defense, when the Russians went into Donbass, even though they said they were not there, and they're, if you recall, little green men, they didn't have insignia or Russian uniform. Well, we don't know who these people are. They're just good, patriotic Ukrainians, but they're really Russian nationals. We don't have anything to do with it. Of course, he lied. But what our concern was then, and then they were in the Crimea, was that we couldn't do a lot to help the Ukrainian army because they just weren't qualified. We couldn't give them the kind of weaponry we're giving them now. The West is giving them now. After 2014, we started training them as well as our NATO partners. But he underestimated that. A totally different Ukrainian army since 2014 and the will of the Ukrainian people. Three, I think the other huge mistake he made, and you can fit all three of what you said into the maybe my three headlines, underestimating how the West was going to respond.
Yeah.
I don't think he had any idea that only Putin could do this, bring NATO together.
Yeah.
I mean, it was only Putin invading another country in Europe, which had never been done since World War II. I mean, under the Iron Curtain, where some of those Eastern European countries, Czechoslovakia in '68 and so on, but they were in the Iron Curtain or within and behind the Iron Curtain. So I think those three general areas were why he has failed me so far. I'll make one last comment on it. Who knows what he has in mind? I mean, he's unpredictable. He's a product of the KGB. Everything he does, how he thinks, how he governs, is based on the KGB model. It's deceit, misinformation, disinformation. And so you expect that from him. But what he will do, I suspect, is he'll continue this and make it a war of attrition and just try to wear Ukraine down. Because in the Russian military, the history of warfare for Russia, Soviet Union, during Tsarist Russia, casualties have never been a big deal. I mean, that's just the cost of doing business. It is different now in Russia because you've got social media, you've got more awareness, so on. But that's the Russian way, just hammer, hammer, hammer. So that's, I'm sure, is what he's looking at, a war of attrition. You'll take enough of Ukraine to say that strategically you've won. It's what we intended to do all the time.
Right.
And then it gets back to what Howard was talking about. Then what happens in the world? Because the consequences of this are going to be immense, and they're going to be with the world for a long time. And what he's doing to the Russian economy, what he's doing to the Russian people, what he's doing to the image of Russia is terrible, and he'll pay a price for it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come back to you in a bit about the war of attrition issue, but let me go back to Harold about sanctions. So there's lots of conversations about, can this money that we're freezing all over the world be used even to fund the reconstruction of Ukraine? I was at Davos last week with a few other people, and lots of people were throwing that out as an easy answer. You talk to a number of legal scholars or Treasury officials, they say it's a lot more complicated. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, about the sanctions piece of this?
Yeah, if we could pull back to what is the West's grand strategy, such as it is, not announced, but I think it's a 5-point strategy. 1, total sharing of information. 2, isolation of Putin and his allies, and including driving off the Chinese from working with him. The goal to make Putin an isolated outlaw in an interdependent world. And then 3, illegality. In every way possible, brand the Russian actions as illegal, which by as many authoritative sources as possible, which adds to the isolation. And then 4th, at a point where Putin calculates that he can't continue this or is told by others, diplomacy. And that's where we're looking at some sort of Dayton kind of conversation, how orchestrated, we don't know. And then finally, in that, accountability, keeping both criminal and civil accountability on the table. So the sanctions piece is part of several pieces of that. And what's been happening is the most coordinated effort at sanctions that we've seen since 1990 against Saddam Hussein after Kuwait, but without a UN Security Council resolution. So that's very impressive. The complication comes in that there is worldwide authority to freeze. What there's less clear is that there's authority to seize. And a lot of countries, I think, are worried that if they actually seize and invest Putin's assets, it will look like a declaration of war against Russia, which is exactly what they're trying to avoid. So I think what's going on in the civil accountability discussion is how to create some kind of compensation commission. A model would be the UN Compensation Commission as it functioned in Kuwait, where after Saddam in, I think it's resolution 678, agreed to this, they could tap into the money of ongoing oil resources and give it to Kuwait, which would allow money to be withdrawn from Putin's accounts or frozen assets now and given to the Ukrainians for reconstruction efforts. How this all gets meshed up and whether the multilateral entities all agree on the same solution is the complicated process now, because everybody's freezing under their national law. In the United States, if you freeze, you have to, if you seize as opposed to just freeze, you have to do it under the Trading with the Enemy Act, which means we're calling the Russians our enemy, which is crossing the line that Biden doesn't want to cross.
Legal issues are always so complicated. Not sure everyone fully understands them. Thank you for that. Dan, let me go back to you. You've talked a bit in your book and elsewhere about this maybe the end of Russia as an energy superpower. Talk through what does that mean for all of us, not just for Russia?
Well, it's very topical. I should have finished the previous thing I said. One last thing, which is I don't think you have energy transition without energy security, which is exactly the problem we're seeing today. So Putin was once asked, is Russia an energy superpower? For the parochial interest of this audience, I should say that he was asked that by somebody who actually I met when I was a Marshall Scholar at Cambridge, who I then subsequently married. So it was a question. And his answer to her was, I don't like the term because it's Cold War-ish. Well, it kind of seems that way right now. But it's clear that he liked the money and he liked the political clout, and a lot of money and a lot of political clout. I think what has now happened is that he has destroyed he's destroyed what he spent 22 years building up as being part of the international economy, but he's also destroyed Russia's brand as a reliable energy supplier. Mm-hmm. So I think we saw yesterday the EU more or less got around to sanctions. If they start put sanctions on the transport of ships as well, so that that people won't be able to take oil from Russia and sell it to India. I think Russia will continue to be a major energy producer, but I think its days as an energy superpower will be over. They're ending, they're not over yet. And because among other things, what he's done is he's completely destroyed and undermined his most important market, which is Europe. Half of his oil and gas, more of his gas and half of his oil went there. And I think that they're pretty firmly in the process, for the most part, in slamming that door. So I think right now he's reaping the benefits because prices are high. He's making more money. But over the next year or two, I think that position really changes. And that's another form in which he has weakened his economy and his hold. It'll take time to unfold, and he won't have that same clout that he's had before.
Yeah, another area, as you were saying, Secretary Hagel, where he made a mistake in judgment. Let me go now back to this attrition question. I guess it's a two-part question, Secretary Hagel. So you mentioned war of attrition. I think the early assumption was certainly the longer it lasts, the better it was for Russia. Now, others are saying actually it could be better for Ukraine because they're getting better weapons from the West. The Russians are just being, they're worn down and they don't have the replacement men to put in to keep fighting. So some people now think the longer it is, the better. So there's that one argument. And then a related argument that you hear is many people are saying we, the West, are doing the wrong, we are prolonging the war by arming Ukraine, and we should be putting more pressure on Ukraine to go to the negotiating table. That's what you started to hear people make that case. Now, the counter argument to that is, of course, Ukraine is a sovereign country. It's their choice to continue the fighting, and we need to help protect them because otherwise might makes right, as you said much earlier. So do you mind talking about those two different pieces? Because I think they can come together.
Yeah. Well, first of all, as we all know, this is imperfect. I mean, no one really knows how this ends, when it ends, where it ends. So that's the reality. That's what we're dealing with. As to specific points that you made and questions you asked, it's my opinion that we should have learned 80 years ago that you cannot appease brutal dictators, invaders. Throughout history, just a cursory reading of history tells us that. Now, does that mean we go to war with Russia? No, I think there's something in between. Essentially, what we're doing now with our Western allies, specific to NATO and EU. But I don't think any way you can excuse this or turn your back on this or say, well, we can only do so much. If that happens in this kind of a world, in this new century, the world is in for a big problem because the Chinese are watching this very carefully. That's just one dimension of this. Obviously, in a smaller way, North Korea is, and what North Korea has been doing over the last couple of months, pulling the stunts it usually pulls just to add to the instability. Iran, we probably are not going to be able to put that 2015 deal back together. It's looking more and more likely that won't happen because of Russia, because of China. Doesn't mean it won't, it might. So I think we've got to hold the line on this in every way we can. On the other more specific question about the war of attrition, is that really in Russia's interest? Well, first of all, I don't know. What I was saying was what you've seen Russia do in the past. And I think where Russia is now, they've probably got no choice to play this out for some time until they can feel that they have gotten some victory, that something that they can achieve, that they can take to their own people and the world and saying, this is what we intended all along. It is risky for Russia to play that kind of a game. You saw where the Duma and the upper house extended the age for men to be drafted into the army. So they've got some manpower issues and they're going to continue to have them. And yes, the longer it goes, in one way, it helps the Ukrainians because we can continue to provide more and more armaments and more sophisticated armaments, like the ship-to-shore, very sophisticated missiles. The Ukrainians don't yet have the capability to operate. They're learning, and they'll probably be ready to go in 2 or 3 months with some of that sophisticated weaponry. So yes, there are arguments on both sides of this, but one of the things that's happening here, you're seeing every day Ukraine be destroyed, and the infrastructure, the people, and they're running out of people as well. And always the concern is, will they run out of will? You already are reading different stories and seeing different TV interviews that's starting to edge in to the reality about the Ukrainian people, their will to keep going. And so, I mean, I'm not smart enough to be able to tell you how it's going to end. But both to your point, both of those sides that you mentioned, Ukraine, Russia, you're right. But the fact is, Russia is the bigger, more powerful country with more unlimited resources, except for this problem. And I don't know if it was Harold or Daniel that mentioned this, but the Chinese are not providing help in armaments to the Russians. The Russians have no friends. They have no allies. So no one is really helping them. People are buying their oil because they have to, but even that's coming to an end, as Daniel pointed out, and for the future, it's terrible for Russia. So that's going to be a problem for Russia because they don't have a limitless stock of these weapons, and especially the ones they're using, artillery, drones, sophisticated missiles. I mean, they've got a finite stock. So that's another factor.
Yeah, great. Okay, well, thank you. I want to hear from the incredible Marshall community. So we're going to do sort of rapid fire questions. Please keep them short. I'll take about 5 or 6 and then I'll go back to the panel. So hopefully you'll all remember the questions. I think we're starting with, Nell, you have somebody in mind? Yeah, please introduce yourself and ask your question, and the panel will take good notes. So will I. Do you want a question here?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. Awesome. Hi, my name is Leah Trotman. I'm a 2021 Marshall at the London School of Economics, and I study health and international development. And my areas of interest really are focused in climate and health. So this question is actually for you, Daniel. So have you given any thought, or has there been any discussion within your work about the disadvantages of labeling the climate crisis as a security crisis? Within my own areas of interest within health, we talk a lot about how there have been a lot of advantages, increased funding for HIV, for malaria, whatever it might be, but there's also been an increase in anti-immigrant sentiment and a ton of other disadvantages. So is that going to be the same thing for the climate crisis, especially considering for the pandemic, when we label it a security issue, a lot of folks started to close down their borders. People started to kind of isolate, and that's not necessarily what we need to see to address the climate crisis. We need more collaboration between countries. So
Okay.
we'll love that.
Thank you for that. Tom Friedman over here, and then I'll come to you. You want to just shout?
A question for you, too. I want to ask Harold and Danford. What's the fate and future of the UN when Russia is now led by one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council? That Putin went from bad boy to war criminal. And can you have a Security Council anymore when you've got someone like that there? I mean, it used to be a collateral victim. And for Dan, talk about how do you look at the underinvestment that the oil industry went into, deliberate underinvestment, because I think Virgil, I want to hear why that they went into this crisis with and how that's shaping the market right now.
Okay. Over here, and then we'll go to you, and then Patricia and you. Okay, let's go for it. And introduce yourself, please.
Hello, I'm Jelani, 2021 Marshall Scholar studying international relations. And my question is for all 3 panelists about, clearly there's countries like Russia that have engaged in a lot of behaviors to justify their isolation, removal from the international system, the international financial system in particular. But there's also second order knock-on effects of this kind of banishment, whether in energy crises or problems with cooperating on nuclear disarmament. And my question is, what lessons from the past, whether it's with Iran or Vietnam, lifting of the embargo in the 90s, or with Libya, do we have for when we can negotiate with pariah states while also maintaining our core security interests?
Good question. Negotiate. Okay, please.
I'm studying U.S.-China relations, and I'm a 2020 Marshall Scholar. So there's been mentioning about the international, the ICC, among other international tribunals. So China has been known to selectively acknowledge international law, depending on its own interests, and moreover, they prioritize their own legitimacy and sovereignty. So how do you incentivize China and other authoritarian states to buy into international law and agreements, especially if agreements present present challenges to party rule.
Great question, Patricia, right? Yep.
Hi, Patricia Lewis from Chatham House. Thanks very much. I really was taken by the remarks that you made, Secretary Hagel, on trust. And I want to address the issue of trustworthiness. So, one of the problems that I think we have been suffering is how our leaders and by inference our institutions have been untrustworthy, how they behave badly, we have corruption, we have lies, we have bad sexual behavior, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we, if you want to build new institutions or build faith in new institutions, trust takes years to build up and minutes to destroy. So how do we improve trustworthiness going forward? And what do we learn from this terrible war, particularly where we have leaders like Zelensky, about trust and how you build trust in leadership?
Okay, thanks, Patricia. And last question in this round, this gentleman here. Sorry, hang on, microphone coming your way.
An audience on Zoom.
I'm with the Marshall Foundation in Lexington, Virginia, trustee. Couple questions. One is, why did the oil traders get away with the oil? Why don't the sanctions work for them? And second thing, this is kind of in the weeds, but what about the 777 howitzers that were supposed to outrange the Russians? Doesn't seem like that's working.
Okay, great. Let's go answer whatever questions you think are appropriate to you, and I'll try to remind you if we miss one. So Harold, why don't you start with your batch?
So let me speak to Tom, Hamza, and Margaret's questions. This is kind of back to the future for me. When I started, the assumption was the Russians would veto everything. And the role of international lawyers was to figure out a way around the veto. And, the Cuban Missile Crisis was an example of imaginative lawyering and imaginative policymaking that got around a Russian veto. Korea, my ancestral country, was saved because of operating under the Uniting for Peace resolution as opposed to under the Security Council. What I'm surprised by when I talk to younger colleagues is starting in '87, when Gorbachev made his speech about international law, followed closely by H.W. Bush on the New World Order, was that a lot of people became kind of formalists about the UN, that if you don't have a Security Council resolution, you can't do anything about peace and security. And then after Libya, when Putin started vetoing things again, we have Syria, which well, 13 consecutive vetoes. I think what we have to do is just return to the old process where the UN can function outside of the Security Council system. But that involves keeping the Chinese on side. This goes to Margaret's point. The Chinese want to be viewed as acting lawfully, even though they very frequently push the rules. An interesting exercise has been in South China Sea, where they were pushing the 9-dash line. But then when a tribunal ruled against them, they now couch all their language in terms of the South China Sea. So I think that, China wants legitimacy to maintain its role in the WTO process. And I think that keeping the Chinese interested in appearance of compliance with international law, when the Russians clearly no longer are, which finally goes to Hamza's point. I think you negotiate with pariah states by not treating the states as pariahs. You treat the leader as pariah. And what you do is you delegitimate that leader and force them to step down and into an accountability process, and then get some other leader. This is what happened in Nuremberg, really, is, Germany and Tokyo tribunals, Germany and Japan continue. It's just that those leaders are tried, and that makes individual responsibility carry the burden, and then allow the pariah state to re-emerge. And, already we're having these signs of, the diplomat in Geneva says, I'm resigning. Television commentators run on TV, demonstrations in St. Petersburg. I'm sure the KGB is wondering, how long can we stick with this guy? And I don't understand, frankly, Biden's people's walking back Biden's comment, about this guy can't continue as a leader. I mean, it's just common sense. I think they should have said this. It's just a statement of fact. And so the question now is how to get him out of the process so that we can resume normal relations. But to Tom's bigger point, should we now have a process where the World War II winners are the ones who have vetoes? It's crazy. I mean, but we don't have a plausible amendment mechanism, which is the real problem. You know, Kofi Annan did a brilliant job of framing a bunch of possible way forward, and we just don't have either the will or the leadership to pick up on those at the moment. We're in entirely reactive mode.
Okay, thank you. Dan, over to you. You got a few questions, including, don't forget about Leah's about climate
Right.
as a security issue and health.
Really quick questions. To disagree with Harold, actually, I mean, there's a possibility Putin will be in power another 5 or 6 years. And so if there's some way to try and bring the conflict to an end, maybe there was some judgment to walk back his statement, but I'll leave it at that. Just to say that there does seem to be less communication ability now with Moscow and the Kremlin than during the Cuban Missile Crisis, actually, which is quite striking, the breakdown. There you had Dobrynin talking to Bobby Kennedy. There's no communication there. On sanctions, really, in fact, the process of self-sanctioning started before there were official sanctions. Most notable, we haven't talked about it, is this 180-degree change in the position of Germany. It's really extraordinary what they've done. And Tom, you were just in Berlin, and the fact that they were getting 35% of their oil from Russia, it's down to 12%. And as soon as they can solve a pipeline problem, it'll be zero. But I saw one of the heads of one of the big trading companies in Davos. He wanted sanctions because if he gets sanctions, he could declare force majeure and get out of his contracts. If there are no sanctions, he can't get out of his contracts and, penalties. So I think that's my understanding of what's happening. Underinvestment, Tom, I think 2 reasons. One is you've had 2 big price collapses. And the second thing is enormous ESG pressure, not very well defined on the part of financial institutions not to spend money. At our conference in March, we had Secretary of Energy Granholm, and she said to the companies, this audience, produce more oil. We want more oil. And one of the major producers came up to her after the lunch and said, 2 investors called me this week and told me not to lift my production from where I was. So it's the investor protection. Despite the honoring of Ray Dolby last night, the acoustics were not perfect, so I didn't actually hear your question very well. So
I think it's just, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's about labeling climate as a security issue, similar challenges with health. Like, does that actually help or does it make it more difficult?
Well, my own reaction, obviously climate is a huge issue and it needs to be addressed. I wonder if by addressing it, and maybe that's where you're going with your question, by addressing it as a security issue, you kind of blur what it's about and you kind of lose the context and the focus. And, if it becomes everything, then in a certain way it starts to lose its punch. I think that's where you're going with your question. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Secretary Hagel, what about you? You have a few questions about trust and the howitzer.
Yeah. Let me quickly respond to a couple of things that Harold and Dan said. In my opinion, climate change is a major security problem. What's happening to the oceans? When I was secretary and I introduced the first Arctic strategy, defense strategy that we've ever had. And when you look at what's going on in the Arctic, the Russians are rebuilding those former Soviet bases up there. The Chinese are now playing up in the Arctic. They have the most sophisticated ice cutters. We have 3 that are old. The newest one's 25 years old. And 2 of the 3, I was just at the Coast Guard Academy about a month ago. 2 of the 3 are out of commission. But the climate issue is going to be a significant defense and security issue for this country and for the world. A point that Harold made, and I think he's right, but I would go so far as to say on the UN, Harold, in how these countries, specifically Russia and China, have veto power in the National Security Council. I think one of the consequences that's going to come from Ukraine and what Russia is doing, because I suspect it's going to get worse. And there are going to be many consequences everywhere in every walk of life: economy, energy, security, geopolitics. I think a reexamination of how the United Nations works. And I think that's coming. As the howitzers, I don't know the specifics because I'm just not engaged anymore at that level to know those things. But I suspect what's going on there, as you noted this week, the Biden administration is starting to move more sophisticated weapons. Well, that's part of it. It's drones and missiles, smart missiles, and howitzers, or, you know, it depends on the situation. But I know that I was just at the Pentagon 2 weeks ago and spent an hour with Lloyd Austin, and what works, what the Ukrainians are capable of handling. Then what the Germans are just announced that they're going to be sending in the last 48 hours, as well as other NATO nations. So I think that's the general answer to your question. I think that that'll increase, and I think the sophistication of those weapons will increase as well once the training is completed by the Ukrainian forces. On trust, Michael Rich, president of RAND, who's just retiring this year, wrote a book about 3 or 4 years ago. Some of you may have read it, called Truth Decay. And I'm on the RAND board. Michael Rich is a phenomenal guy. But he wrote that book because he and I have had long conversations over the last few years about what's happening to our institutions. Gallup, for example, has a poll every year that they do on the 15 largest institutions in the United States. It's a trust confidence poll. You have trust confidence in the judiciary, in the media, big business, small business, police forces, politics, religion, education. Over the years, only the military has scored above 50% on trust and confidence in the American people. And we can understand why. They get about 72, 73% every year. This year, only small business got over 50%. I mean, who's against small business? I mean, that's grandma and grandpa's cookie store and so on. But every institution, every year, other than the military, goes down. And I mean, these big institutions that I just mentioned are in the 20s and the teens. That is a very scary prospect. You're talking about 22% of people in this country have confidence and trust our judiciary system, our media. I mean, I get politics. I mean, I was part of that once. That nobody trusts you, but how you turning that around, and it won't be easy. But and I wish I could give you a better answer, but it's the only answer I know. It's we as human beings are responsible for everything in life. Nobody gets sent to Washington or becomes president or becomes governor or becomes senator without the people at the ballot box in each state going and voting and deciding who do you want to be president, who do you want to be governor, senator, and so on. So it starts with us. And I think we as citizens have become very, very lazy. I'm only speaking to the United States because I don't know about other countries. In doing our job is just basically inform citizens and trying to participate a little bit. I mean, you don't all have to go out and run for office, but if we lose the people, if we lose the individual's responsibility for their government, you remember what Ben Franklin said about, we've given you a republic now, if you can keep it. He was right. Very, very correct. And I wish I was better in explaining this, as at least my opinion of it, or what we could do. But I do think it's really up to us. Another example I'll give you, in our schools, our grade schools and high schools, public schools in the United States, and you all know a lot more about it than I do. Most of them don't teach government anymore. Just basic government. Well, how are you expected to know anything you get out of high school, let alone college, with not even understanding how your government works or having any social studies, just basic social studies? When I was in grade school and high school, we got that. It was just all part of the deal, just a little bit of economics. But hell, we don't do that anymore. It's all about technology. It's all about Twitter and the internet. And I'm not against that. We're not gonna wind that down, or we're gonna not turn that back. But we've got to understand the sophistication of our society enough to manage it. And we're not doing a good job of managing it. And then that's where I think the failure has come in institutions, and because the leaders in so many of these, in so many ways, have let us down. And until we change that, we're not going to change anything.
Thank you for that. I'm really sorry. We could go on all afternoon. We didn't even touch China in a significant way, which we were hoping to do, but we have to get the next panel set up so you can hear from another amazing former Marshall Scholar. So really appreciate one amazing panel. Thank you so much.